For 4 months, I sat at my own dinner table and watched my daughter call another man uncle. I never corrected her. I just kept refilling water glasses and listening to my wife laugh at his jokes, filing away every small detail, the way I file away a bad connection I haven't traced yet. Nobody at that table knew a documentary crew's forgotten microphone was about to do something no argument of mine ever could. 12 seconds recorded months earlier, sitting untouched, until the night 300 people watched them play. None of that had happened yet. 8 months earlier, I didn't know Marcus Reyes's name. I didn't know what a lapel mic could catch if you left it running long enough. All I knew that morning was that the phone was ringing before the sun was fully up, and Odette never got calls before 7. 22 years keeping her camera crews running, and I still wasn't allowed near a photographer. I was adjusting a lapel mic in the editing bay when my own daughter's voice came through the monitor. "Bye, Uncle Marcus." Then my wife, laughing low enough she thought no one heard. "He never checks the equipment logs." I didn't say a word. I just noted the timestamp, then made one call to the one person who couldn't be bought off. So when the lights went down at the premiere, I already knew which 12 seconds were about to play. None of that had happened yet. 8 months earlier, I didn't know Marcus Reyes's name. I didn't know what a lapel mic could catch if you left it running long enough. All I knew that morning was that the phone was ringing before the sun was fully up, and Odette never got calls before 7. I was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to the elbow, coiling a length of audio cable I'd already coiled twice that week. 22 years married to a woman whose whole career ran on waiting, and I'd never once learned how to sit still through it. Odette waited for callbacks that never called back. I waited for her mostly in silence, mostly with my hands busy doing something that didn't need doing. On the counter beside the coffee maker sat the old VU meter I'd rebuilt years earlier from a scrapped mixing board, its needle resting flat at 0. I kept it there the way other men kept a radio playing for noise. It was the one honest instrument in the house, the only thing that never softened how loud a room actually was just to spare somebody's feelings. I liked things that didn't know how to lie. 4 o'clock that morning, before the phone ever rang, I'd already been awake an hour, running through the checklist I ran through most nights I couldn't sleep. Cable ends, connector pins, the small dead spot on channel 3 of the mixing board I still hadn't traced. It wasn't insomnia exactly. It was closer to maintenance, the same instinct that kept me walking the soundstage floor after everyone else had gone home, checking for the one loose screw nobody else would ever notice was missing until something failed because of it. The phone buzzed against the granite hard enough to walk itself sideways. Odette's screen didn't show a contact name. It showed a Los Angeles area code, the kind that only ever called with 2 kinds of news, and both of them were loud. My first thought was Junie. Some accident on campus. Some hospital room 3 states away. 22 years married to uncertainty had trained me to expect the worst phone call first and hope for a better one second. I'd built that habit the hard way, back when Odette's auditions used to end in 3 in the morning phone calls from parking garages, her voice too flat to be anything but devastated, asking me to just stay on the line while she drove home. Odette answered on the second ring, the phone already halfway to her ear before I'd finished the thought. She listened. She didn't speak for 11 seconds. I counted them, the way I counted everything, out of habit, out of nothing better to do with my hands that early in the morning. Her face gave nothing away yet. 22 years of watching that face across casting calls and canceled callbacks had taught me. It never gave anything away until she'd decided how she wanted the room to see it. Then she said yes. Then she said it again, higher. Then a third time, and that one cracked clean down the middle, half laugh, half something closer to disbelief. It wasn't Junie. It wasn't an accident. Some casting director 3,000 miles away had just told my wife, after 19 years of understudy roles and background work and callbacks that never called back, that the lead was hers. Her hand found the coffee mug on the counter without her looking at it, the way her hands did most things by then. On instinct, disconnected from whatever her mouth was busy doing. The mug tipped. It didn't so much fall as slide slow enough that I could have caught it if I hadn't been watching her face instead. It hit the tile and came apart into 3 clean pieces. Coffee spreading fast and dark across the grout lines Odette had picked out herself on her hands and knees 4 years earlier. I remember thinking even then, before any of it, that I should have been the one standing close enough to catch that mug. I knelt down instead and started gathering the pieces off the tile, one at a time, the way I'd have gathered stray screws off a soundstage floor. There was a sentence sitting right behind my teeth, something close to, "I'm proud of you," and I never found the half-second where the room made room for it. So I picked up broken porcelain with my bare hands and let that be the sentence instead. The crash brought Junie down 2 flights of stairs, still in the shirt she'd slept in, hair flattened on one side, already asking, "What happened? Is everyone okay? What's wrong?" Odette turned toward her daughter, with the phone still pressed to her ear, and wore an expression I hadn't seen on her in longer than I could name. Something that hadn't needed rehearsing in a mirror to look real. "Junie," she said, her voice climbing somewhere I couldn't follow anymore. "Junie, I got it! I got the part!" Junie shrieked something wordless and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and the 2 of them collided into a hug tight enough to knock the phone clean out of Odette's hand. Nobody reached for me. I wasn't owed a place in that particular circle, not yet, not for anything I'd earned that morning. I stayed on the floor with my hands full of broken porcelain, holding pieces that didn't fit back together no matter which way I turned them. And something shifted under the floor of my own house, a change I wouldn't understand the shape of for a long time yet. We ate dinner that night with the broken mug still fresh enough in the room that nobody mentioned it, and Odette laughing so hard at one point that she had to set her fork down and press both hands flat against the table, like she needed something solid under her palms to believe any of it was real. Junie kept refilling everyone's glasses, whether they were empty or not, narrating the whole meal like a sports announcer. "Ladies and gentlemen, the champion has arrived at the potatoes!" Odette told the story of the phone call 3 separate times over the course of that dinner. Each version slightly different, the 11 seconds of silence stretching a little longer with each retelling, the casting director's voice growing a little more emotional than I remembered it sounding through the receiver the first time. I didn't correct her. Some stories get to be true in the telling, not just in the happenings, and I'd spent 22 years understanding the difference between the two without ever once explaining it to her out loud. Junie raised her water glass somewhere around dessert and toasted, "To Mom and to Dad, who's going to hate every second of the red carpet stuff." And Odette laughed and said that was probably true. And for a moment, I let myself believe hating it from a comfortable distance was still a kind of belonging. Nobody at that table yet understood the difference between standing near a spotlight and standing inside one, and I include myself in that. I hadn't learned it yet either. Odette's phone rang twice more before we'd cleared the plates, both times a new number, both times her voice sliding into a register I hadn't heard from her since her first agent meetings 20 years earlier. Careful and bright and slightly rehearsed, the voice she used for people who could still say no to her. The second call ran longer than the first. She stepped out onto the back porch for that one, and through the glass I watched her pace the same 6 feet of deckboards over and over, nodding at a person who couldn't see her nodding. When she came back to the table, she said the studio wanted to attach a documentary crew to the awards campaign. Something intimate, something that showed the real her, home life included. Junie whooped. I asked mostly to have something to do with my mouth besides stay quiet, what home life included meant. She said it meant everyone, obviously, and reached over and squeezed my hand once quick, already halfway back into the conversation with Junie about whether the crew would need the good china or if the everyday plates read as more authentic on camera. I noticed even then that authentic had already become a word people used instead of true. 2 weeks later, a van with a production company's logo stenciled on the side idled in our driveway for 11 minutes before anyone got out of it. And I know that because I was the one who noticed the idling, the way I noticed most mechanical things before I noticed the people attached to them. 6 of them climbed out eventually, hauling cases of gear I recognized, down to the model numbers the same brands I serviced 4 days a week on a soundstage 20 minutes from our front door.
Priscilla Ainsley introduced herself on the porch with a handshake dry and quick as a contract signature, a woman somewhere in her 40s with a canvas jacket full of pockets and the particular stillness of someone who'd spent years learning to disappear inside a room while everyone forgot the camera was recording them. I knew her name before she said it. She directed a documentary a few years back about a stunt coordinator who'd been quietly rebuilding cameras between takes for 3 decades. The kind of film crews on our own soundstage still talked about with real respect. The kind of film I'd watched twice, once for the story and once just to study how she'd lit the equipment. I told her that. She looked at me a half-second longer than the compliment required. The way people look at something they hadn't expected to find useful. Like she was filing the information somewhere she might need it later, and hadn't decided yet whether she would. Her crew set up faster than any crew I'd worked alongside in 22 years, and within 20 minutes, one of her boom operators was fighting a hum in the living room audio he couldn't source, cursing quietly at a monitor, while 3 other people waited on him. I found it before he asked me to, a loose ground on an outlet behind the bookshelf. The kind of thing that takes an hour to locate if you don't already know every wall in the house by feel. It took me 90 seconds. Priscilla watched me fix it without a word, arms crossed, unreadable. And for exactly 1 moment, I let myself think that maybe there was a version of this where I got to be useful in a way that showed. Then she found me by the kitchen door while her crew reset for the next setup and told me kindly enough that she wanted to keep the footage focused tightly on Odette and Junie for this section. She said it the way people say things they've said before. To other people's husbands, other people's assistants, other people's whoever wasn't the story. Narrative clarity, she called it. Too many voices muddy the through line, and audiences connect harder with a single point of view they can follow without getting distracted. She wasn't wrong about the craft of it. That was the part that stayed with me longest, that a woman doing her job competently had just explained in professional language I understood better than she probably realized exactly how a man gets edited out of his own life, without anyone involved ever once being unkind about it. I told her that was fine. I meant it mostly in the way you mean things you've had years of practice meaning. I stepped back into the hallway to let the crew reset the living room, and one of the cameras swept past the doorway where I was standing, wide angle, unhurried, and didn't stop on me for even half a second on its way toward my wife. I stood in that hallway a while longer than I needed to, listening through the wall to Odette running her interview answers, with Junie feeding her the questions like flashcards. Tell us about your family, and Odette trying the sentence 4 different ways, in 4 different voices before she found the one that sounded least like something she'd practiced. Junie kept saying that one, "Mom, do that one again. It sounded so natural." And every time she said it, Odette repeated the version that had earned the compliment, sanding it down a little smoother each pass. The door to the hall bath had swung a few inches open, and through the gap I could see her reflection in the mirror. Chin lifted, testing a smile, the way I'd test a signal chain, adjusting one small thing at a time until the levels read exactly where she wanted them. She practiced looking surprised by her own good fortune. She practiced looking humble about a house she'd never once called modest. She practiced 4 separate times while I stood there in a hallway that wasn't yet off limits to me, an answer about family that moved from her childhood to Junie, to her own mother, to the crew standing around her with their equipment, and back to Junie again. She never once, in any of the 4 versions I heard, said my name. The interview aired on a Tuesday, and Odette wasn't home to watch it with us. She was in a hotel conference room somewhere, doing 4 more of the same, back-to-back, the kind of press day that ate a person from the outside in, and so it was just Junie and me on the living room sofa, with a bowl of popcorn neither of us touched, waiting for my wife to arrive inside a television she wasn't standing anywhere near. Junie had the remote and kept the volume a notch louder than the room needed, the way she used to, when she was young enough to believe loud meant important. She'd set 3 separate reminders on her phone earlier that afternoon, texting me each time, like I might have forgotten the exact hour her own mother was scheduled to appear on national television. I hadn't forgotten. I'd been listening for it in the back of my head most of the day, the way you listen for a signal you already know is coming through a cable you didn't lay yourself. The network cut to the interview after a commercial break for a car insurance company,
And there was Odette, lit soft and gold on a studio set built to look like somebody's sunroom, sitting across from a host I recognized and beside a man I didn't. I clocked the lighting rig before I clocked much else, the three-point setup someone had dialed in expertly to smooth 10 years off both their faces. A soft key light doing exactly what a soft key light is supposed to do. Old habits. I'd spent 2 decades noticing the machinery before I noticed the people it was built to flatter. He had the kind of ease on camera that either takes decades to build or gets handed to certain people at birth. One arm draped along the back of the sofa cushion behind Odette, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched when either of them leaned in to make a point. The Chiron across the bottom of the screen introduced him before Odette did. Marcus Reyes, director. He wore his confidence the way some men wear a good watch, casually, like he'd stopped noticing it was there a long time ago. I'd heard the name before, from Odette. In the flat, professional way you hear the names of people who run other people's projects. A name attached to call sheets and script notes, and the occasional late-night email she answered from bed, while I was already half asleep beside her. I hadn't put a face to it. I hadn't understood until that exact moment on the sofa that the man responsible for finding my wife after 19 years of nobody finding her was also a man who apparently found it natural to keep one arm behind her shoulders on national television, in front of an audience that would number somewhere in the millions by morning. Junie didn't say anything about it. I didn't either. We watched the host ask Odette what it felt like to finally get the role of a lifetime, and Odette gave an answer so smooth it barely sounded like an answer at all. Something about timing and gratitude and never giving up on yourself, even when the industry keeps telling you to. Marcus jumped in twice to finish her sentences before she'd finished needing them finished, and both times she let him go, laughing at exactly the moment his interruption landed, tilting her head toward him the way people tilt toward a heat source without deciding to. The host asked a few more questions I only half heard. Something about wardrobe, something about the physical demands of the shoot, Odette answering each one with the same practiced warmth. Marcus adding color where color wasn't strictly necessary. Junie leaned forward at one point to turn the volume up further, and I noticed my own hands had found the edge of a throw pillow and were working the seam of it, back and forth between 2 fingers. The same small motion I used on frayed cable insulation, checking for a fray before it became a break. The host leaned forward for the question I'd been waiting for since Junie turned on the television. The one they always ask. The one Odette had practiced 4 different ways in a hallway mirror 2 weeks earlier, while I stood close enough to hear every version. Tell us about your family. How are they handling all this? Odette's face did something practiced and warm, and I recognized the exact shape of it from the mirror, the chin lift, the small pause before the smile finished arriving. She said her daughter was her whole world, that Junie had been her biggest cheerleader since she was old enough to clap. She said her own mother had waited tables for 30 years to put her through acting classes she couldn't really afford, and that this was as much her mother's win as it was hers. She said the word family twice, both times circling Junie and her mother orbiting the edges of a house she never once named. She mentioned a husband exactly once, in the same sentence as gratitude, in the same breath as the crew and her manager and everyone who'd believed in her. One item on a list of people who'd supported the journey. Indistinguishable in the sentence from anyone else who'd carried a box or made a phone call on her behalf. Marcus, unprompted, added that the real story here was Odette's own resilience. And the host nodded like he'd said something profound. And the segment moved on to a question about award season fashion, before anyone in that studio thought to ask a follow-up about the husband who'd apparently supported a journey without a name of his own. Junie's eyes cut sideways toward me on the sofa. Quick, the kind of look that isn't quite a question and isn't quite an apology. Just a flicker of recognizing something and not knowing yet what to do with the recognizing. I kept my eyes on the screen. I'd gotten good over 22 years at watching things without letting my face admit I was watching them. The segment ended on a wide shot of Odette laughing at something off camera, Marcus's hand briefly at the small of her back as they both stood to leave the set, and the network cut to the same car insurance commercial from before, and Junie muted the television, and neither of us said a single word into the quiet that came after. Junie set the remote down on the cushion between us with more care than a remote required, like she was afraid of what noise it might make. Somewhere down the hall, the house made the small, settling sounds houses make in the evening. A pipe ticking, the refrigerator cycling on. I sat there a while longer with the frayed edge of the throw pillow still between my fingers, running the interview back the way I'd run back a recording with a bad take in it, listening for the exact second where something had gone wrong, and finding instead that nothing had gone wrong at all. Everyone on that screen had done their job well. That was the part I couldn't stop turning over. Nobody had lied. They'd simply told a story with a hole in it exactly the size of me, and told it so smoothly that the hole read as intentional as craft as narrative clarity, and not as anything anyone in that studio needed to apologize for. 3 weeks after the interview aired, I was on set for an unrelated job, a rental company's boom pole that had developed a short somewhere in its internal wiring, and I was crouched behind a lighting stand at the edge of Soundstage 4, cable stripper in one hand, when I saw them come off a take together. The stage smelled the way every soundstage smells, hot lamps and dust, and the particular ozone tang of too much electrical equipment running in one enclosed space. A smell I'd stopped noticing years ago the way you stopped noticing your own house. It was nothing technically. A director and his lead actress walking off a set after a scene, heads bent toward each other, the way people's heads bend when they're discussing blocking, or a line reading, or whether the light hit her face wrong on the second take. Marcus said something. Odette laughed the real laugh, not the one from the television interview, and put her hand flat against his chest for balance as she stepped over a sandbag anchoring a light stand. His hand came up and covered hers there for exactly as long as it took to steady her, and not 1 second longer than that. And I want to be precise about this because precision was the only tool I had left by that point. It was 1 second. Maybe 2. I'd spent 22 years reading rooms for a living, listening for the hum under the hum. And I knew, crouched there with a broken boom pole in my lap, that I'd just watched something I wasn't supposed to be close enough to see. Nobody on that set looked over at me. Nobody ever did. That was the whole design of the job, to be near enough to fix what broke and far enough away that nobody had to account for your presence while it happened. I finished the boom pole repair hands steady the whole time, which I noted even then as strange, that a man could solder a connection perfectly clean while something in his chest was quietly rearranging itself into a different shape. I drove home. I told myself the way you tell yourself things you need told, that closeness on a set means nothing, that actors and directors touch each other in ways that would look like a marriage in any other context, and mean absolutely nothing by the wrap party. I'd worked around enough productions to know that was often true. I'd seen leading men and women hold each other's faces between takes and go home separately to spouses who never thought twice about it. I let it be true for the length of the drive home, 40 minutes of highway I don't remember a single mile of, my hands doing the driving, while the rest of me sat somewhere further back watching myself drive. That night I was back on set again, later shift, running a frequency check on the wireless comm system the second unit used for coordinating between departments. 6 channels of chatter I was supposed to be scanning for interference before a location shoot the next morning. It was routine work. I'd done it 100 times alone in the equipment trailer with a headset and a spectrum monitor, and the particular quiet of a lot after everyone else has gone home for the night. Just the hum of the generator outside and the small green lights of the rack blinking in their patient sequence. You put the headset on, you sweep the band, you note where 2 signals are fighting each other, and most nights the loudest thing you hear is a grip complaining about craft services, or a production assistant confirming a call sheet nobody would remember by morning. Channel 4 was clean. Channel 5 had a director's assistant confirming call times for the morning brisk and bored the way people sound reading a list they've read 100 times before. Channel 6 carried nothing but static until it didn't, until a voice slid into it, clear and close, and unmistakably my wife's on a lapel mic somebody had forgotten to power down after wrap-up. Transmitting from wherever she was sitting into a frequency I happened to be sweeping at exactly the wrong hour of the night. I should have pulled the headset off the second I recognized her voice. There's a professional standard for that, a decency standard, even without the professional one, and I knew it. And I sat there anyway, with my hand hovering an inch above the volume dial while she said something low and unguarded to somebody whose voice I recognized a half-second later as Marcus's. Close enough to the mic that I could hear him breathing between words. I'm not going to put down everything I heard. Some of it isn't mine to spend even now even telling this. But there was a sentence in the middle of it, said in the particular voice Odette used when she thought absolutely nobody was listening. A voice I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to count. And the sentence was this: "Tell me again that none of this is going to change anything, and I need you to actually mean it this time." Nobody answers a question like that, unless there's already something large enough between two people to need reassuring about. I sat in the equipment trailer, with the headset still on for a while after the channel went quiet again. Static filling the space where her voice had been. And I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone, and I didn't drive to wherever she was and start the kind of scene that would have made all of this simple. I ran through the checklist my hands wanted to run through anyway, out of habit. The same one from 4 mornings ago. Cable ends, connector pins, the dead spot on channel 3 I still hadn't traced because a body under enough pressure will reach for whatever ritual it has closest to hand, and mine had always been maintenance. I thought with a clarity that frightened me a little that the version of me who confronted her tonight was a version who might not have a family left to protect by morning, and some old stubborn part of me still believed protecting the shape of this family mattered more than protecting my own place inside it. I lifted the headset off slowly, both hands, the way you handle something you don't want to startle, and set it down on the folding table in front of me without a sound. The cable coiling itself into the same loose figure 8 I coiled everything into out of habit. The spectrum monitor kept blinking its patient green sequence beside me, indifferent, still logging channels I no longer had any interest in sweeping. I sat there a long moment, listening to the equipment trailer hum around me, not saying a single word to the empty room because there was nobody in it who needed to hear what I already understood. And because some part of me had already started doing what I did best. Filing the information away somewhere quiet, deciding what to do with it later, the way I'd learned to do with every other loose wire in this house nobody else had noticed was live. 5 days passed after that night in the equipment trailer, and I said nothing to Odette about any of it. And she said nothing to me that suggested she knew I had anything to say. We moved through the house the way we always had. Coffee in the morning, the news on low in the evening. Her memorizing pages at the kitchen table while I refilled her water glass without being asked. If you'd filmed those 5 days and shown them to a stranger, the stranger would have called it an ordinary marriage. I'd gotten very good by then at building rooms a stranger could believe in. I went to work each of those 5 mornings the same way I always had, and I did the work. Well, better than well. And nobody on any of the 3 sets I serviced that week could have told you a single thing was different about me. I fixed a dead channel on a mixing board in 90 seconds flat that a younger tech had been chasing for 2 days. I recalibrated a shotgun mic that had been picking up wind noise nobody else could isolate. I was by every measure that mattered to the people who paid me exactly as reliable as I'd always been. And there was something almost unbearable about how easy that reliability turned out to be. How little it cost me to keep functioning, while the rest of it sat coiled somewhere under my ribs. She found me in the garage on the 6th evening, elbow deep in a mixing console I'd brought home to repair for a friend who ran a small studio downtown. And she had that particular brightness in her voice she used when she'd already decided something and was only technically asking my opinion of it. She'd changed out of the day's clothes into something soft and comfortable, hair still up from filming, and she leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed loosely, the posture of a woman settling in to explain something, rather than ask it. The studio wanted the premiere handled carefully, she said. It was the first real public event since the interview, the first time press would be in a room with all of us at once, instead of catching us one at a time through a screen, and the optics needed to be clean. Clean was her word. I set down the screwdriver I was holding and let her keep talking because I'd learned that if you gave Odette enough runway, she generally landed the plane herself, without needing you to ask a single question. She said it would honestly be easier on everyone if I skipped this one.
She said the photographers only had so much film, so to speak, so many frames in a given night, and every one of them spent on a candid of the husband standing awkwardly near the bar was a frame not spent on something that actually helped the campaign. She said she knew I'd always hated that kind of thing anyway. The standing around the small talk with people who forgot your name the second they'd said it back to you. And wasn't it sort of a relief, if you thought about it honestly? To just stay home with a glass of something decent and let her handle the circus. I want to be honest about what I felt standing in that garage, because the easy version of this story has me boiling somewhere under the surface, waiting for the moment I'd finally let it out. That isn't quite true. What I actually felt was something closer to recognition, the specific cold clarity of watching a pattern complete itself. The same pattern from the interview, from the crew at the house, from 100 smaller moments I hadn't bothered to add up until they were standing in my garage, asking me to disappear one more time. This time, from an event where a man I now knew for certain was sleeping with my wife would be photographed at her side instead of me. There was a version of this moment where the irony alone should have broken something open in me, should have sent the sentence I know about Marcus straight up my throat and out into the garage air before I could stop it. Instead, I found myself doing what I'd always done under pressure, which was to keep my hands moving. I picked the screwdriver back up without meaning to, turned it once against a screw that didn't need turning, and used the small mechanical action to buy myself the half-second I needed to decide again that tonight wasn't the night. I could have said something. I ran the sentence through my head a dozen different ways while she waited for me to answer, versions that started with, "I know about Marcus," and versions that started with something quieter and worse, and every single one of them ended the same place, with a woman I'd married 22 years ago standing in a garage, looking at me like I was a problem she needed solved efficiently before dinner. And a version of myself who understood with total certainty that saying any of it out loud right now would blow apart a family that hadn't finished falling apart on its own timeline yet. So I told her that was fine. I told her actually that I thought it made sense, framing it in her own logic so she wouldn't have to work for the agreement. And I watched something in her shoulders relax that I recognized as relief. The relief of a person who'd expected a fight and gotten a hallway instead. She uncrossed her arms. She stepped further into the garage and picked up a stray washer from the workbench, turning it over between her fingers, the absent way she did with small objects when a conversation had gone the way she needed it to. She thanked me. She said I was being wonderful about all of this. Wonderful was the word, and she came over and kissed the top of my head, the way you'd thank a very good dog for not barking at the mail carrier. And then she was gone. Back into the house to call someone about seating arrangements, already 3 steps ahead of the conversation we'd just finished having. The washer still sitting where she'd set it back down on the bench, slightly closer to my tools than it had been before. A small displacement I noticed the way I noticed every small displacement in that house by then. I stood alone in the garage a while longer with the mixing console open in front of me. Its guts exposed. 48 channels of wiring I understood completely, laid bare under a single work light. And I thought about how strange it was that I could diagnose a dead channel on a board I'd never seen before in under a minute. Trace the exact break in a signal path just by listening to what wasn't coming through. And still, hadn't found the nerve, hadn't found even the opening sentence to trace the break in the one signal path that actually belonged to me. From the kitchen window, I could see Junie setting the table for dinner, 4 plates instead of 3. And I understood, watching her, that this was the week Marcus had been quietly added to more dinners than not. A 4th chair that had become a habit before I'd noticed it becoming one. And I picked the screwdriver back up and went back to work on somebody else's broken board, because it was the one thing in the garage that night I still knew exactly how to fix. Marcus arrived a little after 6. With a bottle of wine he clearly knew more about than I did, and he set it on the counter, with the easy confidence of a man who'd learned somewhere along the way that showing up with good wine bought you a certain amount of forgiveness for showing up at all. He had a way of filling a doorway that had nothing to do with his actual size. Some quality of certainty that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without anyone deciding to let that happen. Odette kissed his cheek in the doorway the same way she kissed mine.
which was either the most honest thing about the whole arrangement or the cruelest, and I still hadn't decided which. I'd told myself walking into that kitchen that I could sit through one more dinner. I'd sat through 3 already since the night in the equipment trailer. Each one easier than the last, in the specific hollow way that repetition makes anything easier. The way you stop flinching at a loud sound after you've heard it enough times to know exactly what it is. I'd developed, without ever deciding to, a small set of private rituals to get through those evenings, counting the number of times Marcus refilled his own glass before offering to refill anyone else's. Tracking which stories he told twice, without noticing he was repeating himself. It wasn't cruelty. It was the only kind of control left available to me, and I took what I could get. We ate at the big table instead of the kitchen island, which Odette said was because the light was better for the candid photos the studio's social team wanted for an upcoming post, and Marcus took the chair across from me like he'd taken it a dozen times before because he had. Junie sat between us, cheerful in the specific way college students are cheerful when they've come home for a weekend and remembered halfway through the visit how much easier everything is when someone else cooks. The conversation moved the way dinner conversation moves in a house with something to celebrate, easy and loud. Marcus telling a story about a lighting technician who'd nearly dropped a fixture on a very famous actor's head during a shoot years earlier. Odette laughing before he'd reached the punchline because she'd clearly heard the story enough times to know exactly where it landed. Junie asked him a string of questions about the industry, wide-eyed in the way 20-year-olds get around people who seem to have already solved the problem of what to do with a life. And Marcus answered every one of them with the patient generosity of someone who enjoyed being asked. I passed the bread. I refilled water glasses. I did the things I'd always done at that table, the invisible maintenance of a meal. And nobody thanked me for any of it, because nobody had ever needed to. I watched Junie more than I watched either of them honestly. There was something in the way she leaned toward Marcus when he spoke, quick and unguarded, that I recognized from years earlier. A smaller version of her leaning the same way toward me over a broken toy she wanted fixed. And I couldn't decide whether that recognition was the most painful part of the evening or simply the truest one. It was Junie who brought up the premiere somewhere between the main course and the dessert nobody had made room for yet, asking Odette what she was planning to wear. Whether the dress was the blue one or the other one, whether there'd be a red carpet or just a step and repeat. All the small mechanical questions of an event she was clearly excited to hear about secondhand, since she wasn't old enough yet, in Odette's estimation, to attend one herself. Then Junie turned to Marcus, spoon halfway to her mouth, and asked with absolutely no weight in her voice at all, "Is Uncle Marcus coming to this one too?" The table didn't go silent exactly. Marcus answered smoothly something about, of course wouldn't miss it, and Odette said something about the seating chart that moved the conversation forward before it had fully finished landing. And if you'd been a stranger watching from the doorway, you might not have noticed anything wrong with the moment at all. But I'd spent 22 years listening for the sound under the sound, and what I heard underneath Junie's easy, unbothered use of a title that had apparently been settled between the two of them for longer than I'd realized was the sound of a fact that had already been fully installed in my daughter's understanding of the world, load-bearing, unremarkable. The kind of thing nobody thinks to question because nobody ever thought to present it as something questionable in the first place. I found myself doing the math without wanting to, the way you can't help but calculate a total once the numbers are already in front of you. Uncle wasn't a word a 20-year-old adopted casually for a man she'd met twice at a premiere after-party. Uncle was a word that had been offered at some point by someone in a position to offer it and accepted at some point without anyone bothering to check whether it was true. I didn't know when that conversation had happened. I only knew I hadn't been in the room for it, which by then had become the least surprising part of any conversation in this house. I didn't say anything. I want to be clear about that because I've turned this moment over more times than any other one in the whole account I'm giving you. And every time I turn it over, I find the same man sitting silently at the same table, passing the bread, doing nothing. Junie must have felt something shift in the air near me. Some change in temperature I hadn't managed to fully hide, because she looked over at me mid-sentence with Marcus, her face doing something quick and uncertain. a flicker of a question she didn't have the vocabulary yet to ask out loud. I looked back at her. I didn't know what my own face was doing in that moment, whether it had given anything away or held perfectly still the way it usually did. But something passed between us across that table, wordless. The kind of look a father and daughter share when one of them has just said something true without meaning to, and the other one has just heard it without wanting to. She didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't tell her anything was. We just held that look a beat longer than either of us needed to, and then Marcus said something else, and she turned back toward him laughing at whatever it was, and the moment folded itself back into the ordinary noise of the table, like it had never happened at all. I excused myself not long after, said something about a piece of equipment I'd promised to have ready by morning, and nobody questioned it because nobody ever questioned when I disappeared into the workshop behind the garage that had simply always been where I went when I needed my hands busy and my mouth empty. I sat out there a long time that night, with nothing actually broken in front of me, no real job to do, just the quiet hum of the space heater and my own reflection faint in the dark window. And I thought about how a 4-year-old learns the word for a stranger before she learns the word for a lie, and how somewhere in the last several months my own daughter had learned a new word for the man sitting across from her at dinner, and nobody, including me, had ever once sat her down and told her it wasn't true. I could have gone back inside and done exactly that. The thought sat there in the workshop with me for a long while, patient and available, the way a tool sits on a bench waiting for someone to pick it up. I imagined the sentence, imagined Junie's face receiving it, imagined the particular kind of damage that would do to a 20-year-old who'd only ever known her family as something stable enough to leave and come home to. I decided the way I'd decided in the garage 6 days earlier, that some repairs cost more than the thing they're fixing is worth. At least not tonight. At least not with this little warning. I told myself I was protecting her. I didn't examine, not yet, whether I was protecting her or simply protecting myself from watching her face while I said it. The documentary crew kept a shooting schedule the way every production keeps a shooting schedule, a shared calendar file that lived on a server I had legitimate reasons to access, since half my job that season was making sure their equipment didn't fail during whatever they decided to point it at next. Nobody thought twice about me having the login. I was the man who kept the microphones working. Access to the schedule was just part of keeping the microphones working, the same way a locksmith ends up knowing the layout of every house he's ever fixed a door in. I found myself looking at it more than the job strictly required, some evening in early spring, sitting alone in the equipment room at the soundstage with a space heater ticking beside my knee and a cup of coffee gone cold at my elbow. The room smelled the way it always did that time of year, warm dust off the heater coils, the faint ozone of standby electronics. A smell I'd stopped registering as a smell years ago, and had started registering instead, as simply the sensation of being somewhere I was allowed to think. Tuesday living room, 3 cameras, 2 lapel mics. Thursday kitchen, 1 handheld ambient audio only. Friday home office, Odette alone, a segment about her creative process that the crew had scheduled for an afternoon when I happened to know Marcus would also be dropping by under the reasonable, unremarkable pretext of discussing a scene for the following week. I hadn't gone looking for that particular overlap. I want to be honest about that at least because everything after this point in the story gets harder to be honest about. And I'd rather start the harder part from a place where I've told you the plain truth. I found the overlap because I was already looking at the schedule for entirely ordinary reasons, cross-referencing equipment needs against call times, and there it was, sitting in a spreadsheet cell like any other piece of information. Marcus's name penciled into a Friday afternoon that belonged on paper to Odette alone. I didn't do anything that night. I want that on the record too. I closed the laptop and drove home, and lay awake a while listening to Odette breathe beside me, steady and untroubled, in a way that struck me for the first time in months as almost enviable. She had never once, as far as I could tell, lain awake calculating the exact geometry of a room, the way I was doing right then. Whatever guilt she carried, if she carried any at all, apparently didn't cost her sleep. And somewhere in that stretch of dark ceiling, I let myself think just once in the careful, hypothetical way you let yourself think about things you haven't decided to do yet.
that a lapel mic left running during a scheduled segment about creative process would pick up whatever got said in that home office, regardless of what the segment ended up being about. It wasn't a plan. I need to be precise about that distinction, because the difference between a plan and a thought mattered enormously to me at the time, the same way the difference between a live wire and a dead one matters to a man who works with his hands for a living. A thought could be held without consequence, turned over and set back down, left exactly where it had been found. A plan required action, and action required a version of myself I wasn't certain yet that I was willing to become. A version who did things instead of simply noticing them, who reached into a room instead of just reading its layout from a safe distance. 2 days later, back in the equipment room, I found a reason to be there again. A genuinely broken transmitter that genuinely needed my attention. Its casing already cracked when it came in from the rental house. No fault of mine or anyone else's, just an ordinary piece of gear that had earned an ordinary repair. While I had the parts spread out across the workbench, I pulled the crew's mic placement diagrams up on the same screen. The little floor plan sketches Priscilla's sound department used to mark where each lapel mic and each hidden boundary mic would sit for a given setup. The home office diagram showed a single mic on Odette's collar and a boundary mic tucked into a bookshelf angled toward the desk where she'd be sitting for the interview portion. It wasn't angled toward the seating area near the window, the small couch, where anyone dropping by for an unrelated conversation would naturally sit. The couch I'd noticed on more than one visit to that house seemed to be where most of the conversations that actually mattered tended to happen. I looked at that diagram a long time. I told myself I was checking battery levels, checking frequency assignments, the kind of maintenance glance that was technically exactly what my job required of me that week. My hand found the edit function on the shared document almost before I decided to let it. I didn't change the diagram. I want to be clear about that too, because I've spent a long time since then drawing the line between what I actually did in that room and what I only came close to doing. And the line matters to me even if it stopped mattering to anyone else a long time ago. What I did instead was smaller, and somehow felt larger for being smaller. I picked up my phone and called a number I'd saved weeks earlier under a name that gave nothing away. Equipment Contact. The kind of label that could belong to any vendor, any rental house, any one of a dozen people I legitimately needed to reach in the ordinary course of a week's work. Priscilla answered on the third ring, brisk, already halfway into whatever she'd been doing before the phone rang. I told her one of the boundary mics on her list was showing intermittent battery drain, and asked whether her department wanted me to swap the unit before Friday's shoot or wait until the regular equipment check the following week. It was a real question. The battery drain was real. Everything I said to her in that call was on its own completely true, which was the part I kept returning to afterward, that a man could tell the truth in every individual sentence and still be building something underneath the sentences that wasn't true at all. She said Friday was fine, no rush, and thanked me for staying on top of it, and the call ended in under a minute. Ordinary and forgettable. The kind of exchange that happens 100 times a week on any production and gets remembered by absolutely no one. I sat with the phone still warm in my hand for a moment after she hung up, turning over the strange, small satisfaction of having done something that felt, in the doing of it, like the first genuinely deliberate act I'd taken since the night in the trailer. Even though on paper it was nothing more than a maintenance call about a battery. I set the phone down on the workbench beside the open transmitter casing and sat there a while with my hand still resting near it, not quite ready to pick the screwdriver back up. Looking again at the little floor plan on the screen, the single mic on Odette's collar, the boundary mic angled just slightly away from the couch by the window. And I found myself doing something I hadn't let myself do since the night in the equipment trailer, which was imagine in specific patient detail exactly what it would take to point that boundary mic 6 inches to the left. 6 inches. That was the whole distance between a diagram that protected everyone in that house and one that protected exactly none of them. And I sat there a long time with my hand hovering over the trackpad, not moving it, not yet, just measuring the distance, the way I measured everything, carefully, before I ever let myself touch it. Priscilla found me by the craft services table the following Monday, coffee in hand, and told me the crew had had one of their smoothest weeks yet. No dead batteries, no dropped signals, nothing lost to a technical failure that shouldn't have happened in the first place. She said it the way you'd thank a good mechanic, brief and genuine, already halfway to her next task before the sentence finished landing. "You always set us up perfectly, Wade," she said. "I don't know what we'd do without you." I told her that was just the job. I meant it mostly the way I meant most things I said that spring, true on the surface and considerably less simple underneath it. And she nodded and moved on to whatever was next on her list, and I stood there a moment longer than the compliment required, turning the sentence over, wondering exactly how much of what she'd just thanked me for I actually deserved credit for, and how much I'd simply allowed to happen by not unhappening it. Perfectly was a strange word to have earned. I'd spent 22 years earning it honestly, and I wasn't sure yet whether that streak had ended or simply changed shape without my fully agreeing to the change. I still hadn't moved the mic. I want that clear even now, even this far into telling you about it. What I had done in the days since that night, in the equipment room, was smaller and harder to name, a kind of attentiveness that looked from the outside exactly like competence and felt from the inside like something considerably less innocent. I'd started arriving earlier to the setups I knew mattered. I'd started staying later, finding small, legitimate reasons to be present for equipment checks nobody had specifically requested. I'd started noticing with a clarity that unsettled me precisely which rooms in that house carried sound the farthest, which doorways left ajar, let a private conversation travel clean into a hallway where a boundary mic happened to already be angled just right without my needing to touch anything at all. Which windows left cracked for air on a warm afternoon, turned an entire patio conversation into something a lapel mic 30 feet away could pick up almost as clearly as if it had been clipped to the speaker's collar. None of it was sabotage exactly. I kept telling myself that in those days the way you tell yourself something you need to believe rather than something you've fully proven. I wasn't planting anything. I was simply present, competent, and increasingly aware of a house's acoustics in a way that happened purely by coincidence to serve a purpose I hadn't yet said out loud to anyone, including myself. Marcus caught me alone in the equipment room 3 days later. A Thursday, the crew wrapped for the afternoon, and most of the trucks already pulling out of the driveway. I hadn't heard him come in, which surprised me because I generally heard everyone come in. That was half of what the job trained a man to do. And the fact that he'd managed to cross the gravel and the metal ramp into the trailer without my catching it told me something about how carefully he'd chosen the approach. I wondered later whether he'd waited outside for a moment first, listening, the way I listened, before deciding it was safe to come in. He leaned against the door frame the way he leaned against everything, like a man who'd never once in his life needed to ask permission to take up space, and watched me coil a length of cable for a moment before he said anything at all. He was dressed down for a Thursday, no crew around to perform, for just a plain jacket and the kind of unhurried posture that made a person seem taller than they actually were. I kept coiling. It seemed like the safer option, giving my hands something to do while I waited to find out what he actually wanted. The same trick I'd relied on my whole life. Keep the hands busy and let the rest of the room wait. "You've been very hands-on with this shoot," he said finally. And there was nothing accusatory in his tone. Nothing you could have pointed to on a transcript and called hostile. Just a careful, testing weight underneath the words. The kind of weight a man uses when he's decided to see what happens if he pushes gently on something he suspects might not be as solid as it looks. I told him I took my job seriously. Always had that. A production this size generated a lot of equipment that needed looking after, and I happened to be good at looking after it. It was true. Every word of it was true. The same way every word I'd told Priscilla on the phone had been true, and I was starting to understand by then that this particular kind of truth was its own tool, sharper in some ways than an outright lie, because there was nothing in it a person could hold up afterward and call a deception. He studied me a moment longer, head tilted slightly. The same appraising look I imagined he gave a scene that wasn't quite working yet, searching for the exact frame that would fix it. "I've directed a lot of crews," he said.
You learn to tell the difference between a guy who's just thorough and a guy who's paying attention to something specific. I didn't answer that directly. I asked him if there was a piece of equipment giving him trouble, which wasn't an answer at all, and we both understood that it wasn't, and he let the silence sit there a beat longer than either of us needed it to, testing whether I'd fill it with something more. Somewhere outside the trailer, a truck door slammed, and neither of us looked toward the sound, both of us too committed to the small standoff in the room to break it for something as ordinary as a truck door. I didn't fill it. 22 years of standing in rooms where the correct professional response was silence had taught me that a man who doesn't need to fill a silence is a man who's already decided he has nothing to prove, and whether or not that was true of me in that particular equipment trailer, it was the version of myself I was capable of performing on command by then, whenever the moment required it. I finished the loop of cable in my hands and set it on the shelf behind me, unhurried. The same deliberate slowness I used on anything I needed my hands to look calm doing. Marcus straightened up off the doorframe, eventually unhurried himself, and told me to let him know if I ever needed anything. In the specific tone of a man extending an olive branch he didn't fully believe was necessary yet, but wanted available in case it became necessary later. It was, I thought, a fairly elegant thing to say to a man you suspected of something you couldn't name. Generous enough to seem harmless, pointed enough that I understood exactly what he meant by it. Then he turned and walked back out across the gravel toward his car, and I watched him go through the trailer's small window. Watched him pause once, hand on the car door, and look back toward the trailer for a second or two, longer than a man simply leaving usually looks back at anything before he got in and drove away. I stood at that window a while after his taillights disappeared down the drive, running the whole exchange back through my head, the way I ran back a bad take, trying to locate the exact moment where I'd given something away, and finding uncomfortably that I couldn't locate it, which meant either I'd given nothing away at all, or I'd given away something I didn't yet have the vocabulary to recognize as a tell. I wasn't in that editing bay the night this happened. I want to say that plainly before I tell you about it, because everything in this part of the story comes to me secondhand from Priscilla herself. Months later, sitting across from me with her own notebook open on the table between us, reading back to me the timestamps she'd written down in the moment. The way a person reads back testimony they gave under oath and never expected anyone else to need. I've reconstructed what follows as faithfully as I can from what she told me checked where I could against her own handwritten notes, which she'd kept in the same careful, dated shorthand she used for every shoot day columns, and timestamps, and a running log of what each file contained. Some of it, I'll admit, I've had to imagine the shape of, the exact angle of a monitor, the particular quality of light in a room I've never once stood in myself. But the facts of it, the parts that matter, came from her own mouth, told to me slowly, in the specific, careful way people tell you things they've rehearsed telling you. Correctly. She was alone that night, working late, the way documentary editors work late trying to shape 3 months of raw footage into something with a spine, the studio's awards season deadline pressing closer every week, whether the story had actually finished happening or not. The editing bay was one of a dozen identical rooms down a windowless hallway. A desk, 2 monitors, a chair that had stopped being comfortable somewhere around hour 3 of any given session. The whole space lit by nothing but screen glow and a single desk lamp angled away from her eyes. She'd pulled up the audio from the home office segment, the one scheduled for a Friday afternoon back in early spring, looking for a clean 40-second stretch of Odette talking about her creative process to use as a transitional voiceover. She had her headphones on. She had a mug of tea gone cold beside the keyboard, the way mine always went cold beside me in rooms just like it. She scrubbed forward through the file, past the interview portion, past a long stretch of Odette alone at her desk, and into a section of audio she hadn't specifically asked her assistant to log yet. The ambient pickup from later in the afternoon, after the formal interview had wrapped and the crew had technically stopped rolling, but the boundary mic still live. Still recording to the same drive out of habit had kept doing its job. She told me she almost skipped past it entirely. It was ambient audio, unscripted.
The kind of thing an editor scrubs through at high speed looking for anything usable and discards 90% of background noise that exists on a drive purely as insurance against the small chance something in it might someday matter. But something in the tone of a voice caught her ear even at that speed. Some quality she couldn't name until she slowed the playback down, an inflection that didn't match the register people use when they know a camera might still be rolling somewhere nearby. When she did slow it down, she heard Odette's voice low and unguarded, and a second voice answering her from somewhere closer to the mic than either of them likely realized. She sat with that for a long moment, she told me. Not moving. Just listening the way you listen to something you already suspect you shouldn't be hearing. Waiting to be proven wrong about what it was. Some part of her still hoping the next few seconds would resolve into an innocent explanation, a rehearsal, a joke, anything that would let her close the file and go back to looking for her 40 seconds of usable voiceover. She wasn't proven wrong. The conversation ran nearly 6 minutes, unmistakable in its content, unmistakable in what it confirmed about two people who were on paper colleagues on a project about to hit its highest profile moment of the year. She didn't write down what was said. She told me that specifically too, that she'd made a deliberate choice not to transcribe any of it, only the timestamp, only the fact of its existence. Because some things a person hears in the course of a job aren't theirs to put into permanent language. What she did next, she said, was purely professional instinct. The same instinct that had made her good at this job for 15 years. She didn't jump to conclusions about what the recording meant for the film. She started asking a different question. A technical one, the kind of question that came naturally to a person who understood exactly how a documentary crew's equipment worked, and exactly how unlikely it was for equipment to work this well by accident. She pulled up the placement log for that shoot day, cross-referenced it against the actual audio levels in the file, checking the pickup pattern against the mic's documented position, the way you'd check a math problem you already suspected didn't add up. A boundary mic, tucked into a bookshelf, aimed toward a desk 8 feet away, shouldn't have caught a conversation happening near a window on the opposite side of the room with this much clarity, not without help. Not without someone having nudged the angle by some small margin that wouldn't show up as tampering on any equipment log, only as a stroke of unusually good luck for anyone reviewing the footage later. She found that the boundary mic captured that conversation at a clarity that shouldn't have been possible from its documented position in the room. And she sat with that discrepancy a long moment, tapping her pen against the edge of the notebook, before she let herself consider what it might mean. She reached for a second file, an older one, part of the raw dailies from a shoot 3 weeks earlier that she'd flagged at the time for an unrelated reason and never gotten around to reviewing fully. It was B-roll audio, a wireless channel that had picked up crew chatter between setups, mostly useless, mostly the kind of thing that got deleted in the first pass of any edit. She scrubbed through it out of habit more than purpose, and somewhere past the 4-minute mark she found a voice she recognized as Marcus's, low, half-joking, talking to someone off mic about the crew, about how tight everyone ran on this production. "Wade controls every mic on this set," the voice said. "Don't ever underestimate him." She played it again. She told me this specifically, that she rewound it and played it a second time, then a third, sitting very still in that editing bay, with her headphones pressed tight against her ears and the cursor hovering over the timestamp. And somewhere in that third listen, the two files stopped being separate things in her mind and became instead two halves of a single question she hadn't known to ask an hour earlier. She wrote the timestamp down in her notebook. She told me in the same neat handwriting she used for everything, and then wrote it down a second time on the line below, as if writing it twice might make the implication of it settle into something she could actually hold. She didn't call anyone that night. She didn't wake her assistant, didn't email a producer, didn't do any of the things a person in a more dramatic version of this story might have done. She told me she simply sat there a while longer, headphones still on, the two audio files still open side by side on her screen, and let the quiet of the room do whatever it needed to do to her, before she trusted herself to move again. The room around her, she said, had gone completely quiet by then. Not the ordinary quiet of an editing bay at midnight, but a different kind, closer and more particular. The low electrical hum of monitors and hard drives sitting underneath everything. The way it always had present but unheard
until a moment like that one made her hear it again. All at once, for the first time in months. She didn't sleep on it, she told me. She'd wanted to, told herself she'd look at it fresh in the morning with a clearer head, the way any reasonable person handles a discovery like that. Sleep first, judge later. But by 1 in the morning, she was still sitting in that editing bay, the 2 files still open. And by 1:30, she'd given up pretending she was going to leave, gathering her coat off the back of the chair, only to set it back down again. Twice, she opened a third window on her monitor, the shared production calendar the whole crew used to track equipment assignments, call sheets, who'd signed off on what gear for which shoot day. The same mundane administrative record that had never once in 15 years of editing told her anything worth staying up half the night for. She started with the Friday in early spring, the home office segment, and pulled up the equipment sign-off log for that morning. It named the rental house, the specific gear checked out, and beneath all of it, in a field most people scrolling through the calendar would never think twice about, the technician who'd performed the pre-shoot check and confirmed every mic and camera was functioning within spec before the crew arrived. It was the kind of field she'd filled her eyes past 100 times without ever once reading the name in it. The administrative wallpaper of a production present on every page and meaningful on none of them. Until suddenly, it was. Wade Kessler. She told me she stared at that name for a while, without it fully landing the way a word can sit on a page and refuse for a few seconds to resolve into the thing it means. It was, on its face, an entirely unremarkable entry. He was the equipment technician assigned to half the shoots that season, his name sitting in that field on a dozen other unremarkable days she'd scrolled past without a second thought. His name showing up on a pre-shoot check log wasn't evidence of anything. Plenty of ordinary explanations could account for it. She listed them to herself one after another the way she said she'd trained herself to do, with any circumstantial detail before letting it mean something in an edit. Coincidence of scheduling. A small crew with a limited rotation of qualified technicians. The simple, boring likelihood that if you needed audio equipment serviced often enough, sooner or later the same competent man would be the one servicing it. She pulled the second date next the B-roll shoot from 3 weeks earlier, the one where she'd found Marcus's voice on the wireless channel. She checked the crew roster for that day too, scrolling past names she recognized without slowing. Gaffers, a production assistant who'd since moved on to another job, and there it was again. The same name, the same job title, present and accounted for on both days. That mattered. The 2 days that had somehow produced the only 2 pieces of audio in 3 months of footage that had any business existing at all. The odds of that being coincidence, she told me, weren't the kind of odds she was in the habit of ignoring. 15 years of cutting documentaries had taught her that patterns which looked like coincidence twice almost never turned out to be coincidence a third time if you kept looking. She told me that was the moment the shape of it actually arrived, not gradually, the way you'd expect an idea to build. One small realization stacking politely on the last, but all at once the way a circuit either completes or it doesn't. No useful state in between. Dark one instant and fully lit the next. Wade Kessler wasn't a stranger who happened to service equipment on 2 unlucky days. Wade Kessler was Odette's husband. Wade Kessler was the man who'd stood quietly in the corner of every shoot for months, fixing hums nobody else could locate. Arriving early, staying late, thanked more than once by name in front of the whole crew for how reliably he kept things running. And Wade Kessler was also, according to the equipment logs sitting open in front of her, the single person with legitimate professional access to every mic placement diagram, every frequency assignment, every square foot of acoustics in that house, the one man on the entire production, with both the motive she was only beginning to imagine and the means to act on it, without anyone, including her, ever thinking twice to check. She said she thought first about calling Odette. She dismissed that within seconds, she told me, for reasons she didn't fully articulate to herself that night. And only worked out later something about not yet knowing whose side of this she was even supposed to be standing on. Whether the woman in that recording deserved a warning, or whether the man whose name kept surfacing on these logs deserved the benefit of a doubt she hadn't yet decided he'd earned. There was also, she admitted to me, a simpler and less noble reason underneath the principled one. which was that she genuinely didn't know what she would even say. How a person opens a conversation that starts with, "I think your husband may have engineered a way to catch you on tape." She thought about calling her producer next. She dismissed that too for reasons that were more practical. That a documentary crew's entire value proposition rested on footage nobody could later claim had been manipulated. And the moment she raised this internally, before she understood what she was actually looking at, she risked the whole project getting quietly buried by people with far more to lose than she had. A studio facing the possibility of a tampered recording on an award season property wouldn't necessarily choose transparency. It might just as easily choose to make the entire problem disappear, files and footage and career included. And she wasn't prepared, not yet, to be the person who handed them that choice before she'd made her own. So she did neither. She sat in the editing bay a long while longer, the cursor still hovering over Wade's name in the crew roster, turning the same question over from every angle she could think to turn it from. Had he done this on purpose? Had he simply been thorough, careful, professionally attentive in a way that happened to produce an accidental miracle of timing, not once, but twice? She wanted, she told me very badly, to believe the second version. She was honest enough with herself, even at 1 a.m, to admit she didn't quite manage it. I asked her once, much later, what finally made her stop turning it over and actually do something about it. She said it wasn't a decision so much as an absence of one. She simply reached the point where continuing to sit there stopped producing anything new, and the only thing left to do with the 2 open files and the 1 name on the roster was to close the laptop, which she did, carefully, the way you close something you're not finished with yet, rather than something you've decided to set aside for good. Lid lowered slowly enough that it didn't fully click shut on the first try. She didn't delete either file. She told me that specifically unprompted, like it mattered to her that I understood she'd made that choice on purpose, that it hadn't simply been an oversight born of exhaustion at nearly 2 a.m. Whatever this was, whoever had built it, and whoever it was going to hurt when it surfaced, she wasn't going to be the person who made it disappear before anyone else had the chance to understand what it was. She gathered her coat a 3rd time, and this time she put it on, and she told me the last thing she did before leaving that editing bay was glance back once at the dark monitor, as if some part of her expected the name to still be visible through the black screen, waiting there for whenever she came back to face it again. Priscilla hadn't deleted the files, but she hadn't left them sitting exposed on a shared drive either. What she'd done the morning after that night in the editing bay was flag both of them in the asset management system as restricted pending review, a standard enough designation that any editor might apply to footage that needed a legal or continuity check before it went anywhere near a rough cut. She'd told herself, filling out the flag, that she was simply following protocol, protecting the material until she'd decided what to do with it. And she believed that explanation right up until the moment it stopped being sufficient. It wasn't a red flag to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking for. It was, unfortunately for her, exactly the kind of flag a director with full administrative access to the project's asset system would notice within a day, if he happened to be the sort of person who checked that system more carefully than most directors bothered to. And Marcus, she'd learned, was exactly that sort of person. A man who read call sheets and asset logs the way other people read box office numbers compulsively first thing in the morning. Marcus showed up at her post-production office on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, which she told me was unusual enough on its own to put her slightly on guard, before he'd said a single word. Directors visited editorial. That part was normal. Directors who called ahead 30 seconds before knocking, already halfway through the door by the time she looked up from her monitor, were doing something closer to catching a person off balance on purpose. He'd dressed the visit in casualness, she said, an untucked shirt, a coffee in hand he didn't offer to share. The specific costume of a man who wanted the meeting to read as spontaneous rather than the deliberate, calculated thing it clearly was. He asked how the cut was coming along easy and conversational, dropping into the chair across from her desk like he had every right to be there. Which technically he did. He glanced around her office while he waited for her answer.
The way people glance around a room when they're actually cataloging it rather than simply looking at it. Taking in the second monitor, the stacked hard drives, the notebook she'd left closed but visible on the corner of her desk. She gave him the answers she gave everyone that week, on schedule, a few storylines still needing tightened structure, nothing unusual. He nodded along, glanced at her monitor, and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she'd run into any footage that needed flagging for legal. Said in the tone of a man asking about the weather rather than a man who already suspected the answer. She told him there were always a few files that needed a second look before they went into a cut. It was true, she said, on every project she'd ever worked, and it was true here too, and she watched him absorb that answer and file it somewhere behind his eyes without quite accepting it as the whole truth. He shifted then, she told me, in a way she recognized immediately from years of sitting across desks like this one from men used to getting what they wanted through charm first and pressure second. Men who'd learned early that most people cave somewhere in the space between flattery and a favor if you offer both in the right order. He mentioned casually that the studio was already talking about a follow-up project, something with real creative freedom attached, full final cut, a budget she wouldn't have to fight for line by line the way she'd fought for this one. He said her name a lot in that part of the conversation, Priscilla this and Priscilla that, the specific overuse of a name that people do when they want you to feel personally, individually seen by an offer that's actually built for anyone in your position. He talked about her earlier film, the one about the stunt coordinator, called it one of the most honest pieces of work he'd seen in years, and she told me she couldn't decide in the moment whether the compliment was sincere or simply the next tool in the same toolbox as the offer that followed it. She let him finish. She told me that was important to her, letting him lay the whole thing out completely before she responded, because she wanted to be certain later that she'd understood exactly what was being offered and exactly what it was being offered in exchange for. Even though neither of them ever said the second half of that sentence out loud, he was careful that way, she said. Everything he'd offered her could be defended afterward as simple professional generosity, a director recognizing talent and wanting to work with it again. Nothing in it could be pointed to directly and called a bribe, and that carefulness told her more about the size of what he was protecting than an outright bribe would have. When she did answer, she said it plainly. She told him she appreciated the confidence in her work and that she was flattered by the idea of a follow-up project, and that none of that changed anything about how she handled footage on this one. She told him specifically that her contract with the studio guaranteed her final cut authority over factual accuracy in exchange for the studio's own guarantee that nothing in the finished film would be manipulated to protect any individual's public image, subject included, and that she took that clause as seriously as any clause she'd ever signed in 15 years of doing this work. She said it without raising her voice, without any particular heat behind it, the same measured tone she'd have used to explain a lighting decision, because she'd learned. She told me that heat was exactly what a man like Marcus expected and knew how to work with, and flatness was the one thing he hadn't come prepared for. He asked, still pleasant, still easy, whether that meant something specific was in one of those flagged files. She told him it meant exactly what she'd just said, no more and no less, and that if there came a point where something in a flagged file needed to be discussed with the subjects of this documentary, she'd be the one who decided when that point had arrived, not before, and not because anyone had offered her a reason to decide otherwise. The room went quiet for a moment after that, she said. The particular quiet of two people who'd each just heard the other say something they weren't going to be able to unhear or negotiate around. Marcus's easy posture didn't change exactly, but something underneath it did. Some small recalibration she could see happening behind his face, even as the rest of him stayed perfectly composed. The look of a man rapidly revising a plan he'd walked in fairly confident about. He stood, eventually told her he appreciated her diligence, used that word specifically, diligence, and said he was sure it was nothing whatever she'd flagged, probably just standard caution on her part. She agreed that it probably was, in the same flat professional tone she'd used for the rest of the conversation, and neither of them believed the other, and both of them understood that neither of them believed the other. And he left her office without either of them having said one word more than the surface of the conversation required.
She sat at her desk a while after the door closed behind him, she told me, listening to his footsteps recede down the hallway toward the elevator, and found herself thinking, oddly, not about Marcus at all, but about the man whose name was still sitting flagged in her system, 2 floors down, wondering whether he had any idea yet that the ground beneath whatever he'd built was already starting to shift. Whether he was even the kind of man who'd notice a shift like that before it was too late to do anything but stand in the middle of it. Priscilla found me on a Saturday, which told me something before she'd said a word, because Saturdays were the one day that season when the crew never worked, and the equipment room stood empty enough that a person could talk in it without anyone else overhearing. She'd texted asking if I could meet her there to look at a transmitter she said was acting up. There was no transmitter. I understood that within about 4 seconds of seeing her face, the way she stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon. The way her eyes went straight to me and stayed there instead of doing the customary sweep of the equipment shelves. A person actually worried about a transmitter would have done first. She closed the trailer door behind her, which she'd never done before, not once, in months of us working within a few feet of each other, and set her bag down on the workbench with a care that told me she'd rehearsed this conversation more than once on the drive over. She asked if I had a few minutes. I told her I had as many as she needed, which was true in a way that went beyond politeness, because some part of me had been waiting for this exact conversation since the night I first pulled up the mic placement diagrams and let myself imagine moving 6 inches to the left. And now that it had finally arrived, some strange, quiet part of me was almost relieved to stop carrying it alone. She didn't ease into it. I respected that about her immediately, even through the fear that she wasn't going to make me sit through small talk on the way to the point. She told me she'd found 2 audio files that shouldn't have existed in the shape they existed in. One from a home office shoot in early spring, one from a B-roll day 3 weeks before that, and that both of them traced back through equipment logs and mic placement diagrams to a technician with more access to this production's acoustics than anyone else on the crew. She said my name once plainly, not as an accusation exactly, more like she was setting a fact down on the table between us and waiting to see what I'd do with it. I could have denied it. I want you to understand that I actually considered it, standing there with a screwdriver still in my hand, from whatever I'd been pretending to work on before she arrived, that there was a version of the next 30 seconds where I expressed confusion, asked what she meant, made her carry the whole weight of an accusation she couldn't fully prove without my help. I'd built a career on being the kind of man nobody thought twice about. I could have used that one more time, could have looked her straight in the eye, and let 2 decades of earned trust do the lying for me, the way it had done for me, without my even asking it to over and over for months. I didn't. I set the screwdriver down instead, careful the way I set most things down, and told her she was right. I told her I hadn't planted anything in the technical sense, hadn't moved a single mic from its documented position, that everything I'd actually done would look on paper like nothing more than a technician doing his job with unusual attentiveness. But I told her the attentiveness hadn't been an accident, and that I'd known on some level I hadn't fully admitted to myself until I was saying it out loud to her, exactly what kind of conversations those rooms were likely to hold, if I simply paid enough attention to where they tended to happen. It was, I told her, the only kind of honesty I'd let myself practice in months. The honesty of a man who tells the truth in every individual sentence, while building something underneath the sentences that isn't true at all. And saying that out loud to her felt like setting down something heavy I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. She asked if I regretted it. I thought about that question longer than any other part of the conversation, because it deserved an honest answer more than any of the others had, and because I genuinely didn't know, standing there, whether the true answer was the one that would make me look better or the one that was actually true. She waited. She didn't fill the silence the way most people fill silences, didn't rush me toward whichever answer would end the discomfort of the room faster than— And I understood watching her wait that this was probably exactly how she worked with footage too. Patient enough to let a scene tell her what it actually was, instead of what she wanted it to be. I told her I didn't. I told her that surprised me too, hearing myself say it, because for months I'd told myself I was the kind of man who valued peace over almost anything, who'd rather absorb a wound quietly than open one publicly, and that some part of what I'd done in those equipment rooms had apparently belonged to a different man than the one I'd believed myself to be for 22 years of marriage. I didn't tell her about Junie. I didn't tell her about the 4 dinners with Marcus's chair pulled up to our table, or the word uncle, or any of the specific wounds that had made silence stop feeling like patience and start feeling like something closer to complicity. Some of it wasn't hers to carry, and some of it, if I'm honest, I still didn't trust myself to say out loud, without my voice doing something I wasn't prepared to let it do in front of a woman I barely knew. She asked me directly whether I wanted her to bury the files. She told me she could do it, that a restricted flag could quietly become a deleted one, that nobody besides the 2 of us would ever need to know either file had existed at all, and that she was offering me that option honestly, not as a trap, because she believed she said that the choice belonged to the person the footage would hurt most. And she wasn't certain anymore that person was Odette. She said it plainly, without pressure either direction, and I understood she meant it. That she'd genuinely walked in here prepared to let me choose the quiet ending if I wanted it. Prepared to carry that choice herself afterward, without ever holding it over me. I stood there a long moment with that offer sitting in the air between us. An actual door open leading back to a version of this story where nothing that had happened in those rooms ever had to become anyone else's problem. I thought about Junie's face across the dinner table. I thought about the 4 different versions of an answer about family that had never once included my name. I thought about 22 years of being the kind of man who fixed what was broken and never once asked to be thanked for it. And I understood, standing in that equipment room, that I was finally being offered the exact kind of invisibility I'd spent my whole life mistaking for safety, and that I didn't want it anymore. Not even now. Not even with an easy exit standing right in front of me, with her arms still wrapped around herself, waiting. I told her no. I told her I wanted the cut to show exactly what was on those files, nothing added, nothing removed, whatever the consequences turned out to be for anyone involved, including me. Priscilla looked at me for a long moment after that, longer than the answer strictly required. The same appraising look I imagined she gave a piece of footage she was deciding whether to trust. "The cut stays exactly as it is," she said. Odette couldn't sit still the night before the premiere. I noticed it the way I noticed most things by then, from a slight remove half in the bedroom and half in the adjoining bathroom where I was pretending to organize a drawer of toiletries that didn't need organizing. Watching her cross the same stretch of carpet over and over in the mirror's reflection, phone in hand, thumb hovering over a name she wasn't quite calling. She'd laid out 3 different dresses across the bed earlier that evening. Then 2, then finally settled back on the first one. The same indecision working its way through every small choice she made that night. As though some part of her understood, without being able to name it yet, that tomorrow was going to require more armor than a single dress could provide. She'd been like this for 2 days, ever since Marcus had, by her account, gone strangely quiet on her calls. Unreturned for hours at a stretch. Texts answered in the kind of clipped, businesslike shorthand that told a person everything by telling them almost nothing. I knew why, of course. I'd been the one who'd sat across from him in that equipment trailer and watched him decide I might be worth worrying about. I said none of that to her. I've gotten very good by then at knowing things. I said nothing about a whole private archive of them sitting quiet behind my ribs, while I helped her decide between 2 dresses that, by any objective measure, looked almost identical. She asked me somewhere around 10 o'clock whether I'd seen any of what the documentary crew had been cutting together. She asked it lightly, folding a dress over the back of a chair for the 3rd time that evening, not looking at me directly. The specific, practiced casualness of a question a person has been building up to for a while and finally decided to release under cover of an unrelated task. Her voice hit exactly the right register of idle curiosity, and I might have believed it was nothing more than that, if I hadn't spent 22 years learning the particular weight she put behind questions she'd actually been rehearsing. I told her I hadn't seen any of the actual footage, which was true. I told her Priscilla ran a tight ship and didn't share rough cuts outside her own team, which was also true.
I didn't tell her that I'd stood in an equipment trailer 3 days earlier and told the woman running that tight ship exactly what I wanted her to do with 2 specific files because that particular truth belonged to a different conversation, one I wasn't ready to have yet. And possibly one I was never going to be ready to have. Not with her. Not like this. Not the night before 300 people watched her walk into a room believing she still had something left to lose control of. She let the subject drop, or seemed to, folding the dress a 4th time before finally hanging it properly in the closet, and I watched her pick her phone back up and actually dial this time, watched her hold it to her ear and pace to the window and back 3 full circuits of the room before whoever she'd called finally picked up. It wasn't Marcus. I gathered that much from her side of it. The register of her voice too polished for a private call, too careful. The voice she used for people who could still say no to her. I heard fragments, something about wanting a look at the assembly before the festival screening, just for peace of mind, purely for peace of mind, she said. That phrase twice. And something in the way she said it the second time told me even she didn't quite believe it meant what it was supposed to mean. Whoever was on the other end of that call told her no. I couldn't hear their words, only the shape her face made receiving them, a brightness dropping out of it, in stages, professional composure sliding back over the gap almost as quickly as it opened. Thank you. Of course, I completely understand. No need to apologize. All delivered in a voice so smooth I might have believed it myself if I hadn't been watching her hands the whole time, one of them gripping the phone hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale against her own skin. I found out much later, from Priscilla, that the call had gone straight to a studio executive's desk by morning flagged and noted. One more small data point confirming for everyone above her that something in this production needed protecting from Odette's own growing unease, and that the safest way to protect it was to change nothing at all. I didn't ask what the call had been about. I want to be honest about why, because the easy version of this story has me staying silent, out of some careful, strategic patience, waiting for the right moment to spring something. That wasn't quite it, not that night. What I actually felt, watching her set the phone down on the dresser with more care than the moment required, was something closer to pity, an old, unwelcome tenderness for a woman who was pacing a bedroom at 11 at night trying to arrange a preview of her own downfall without knowing that's what she was arranging, and beneath the pity, quieter, harder to look at directly, something that might have been its own kind of cruelty. The specific cruelty of a man who finally held the one piece of information that would end her fear completely, and had decided deliberately not to hand it over. I could have said one sentence and ended 2 days of her circling this bedroom like something caged. I chose the drawer of toiletries instead, straightening bottles that were already straight, and told myself the choice was mercy, sparing her one more night of peace before whatever was coming arrived on its own schedule, though I understood even then that mercy and cowardice can wear each other's clothes so convincingly that even the man inside them sometimes can't tell which one he's actually being. She went to the bathroom mirror not long after, the same mirror I'd once watched her rehearse 4 versions of an answer in front of months earlier. And I stood in the doorway of the walk-in closet where she couldn't quite see me, watching her practice her face for tomorrow, the way she always did before something important. Chin lifted, shoulders back, testing the particular smile she wore for cameras she hadn't yet learned to stop performing for, even alone in her own house. In the middle of the night with nobody watching but a husband she believed was still occupied with a drawer. It didn't hold. I watched it not hold, watched the corners of it tremble once, twice, some current running underneath her control that hadn't been there in any of the rehearsals I'd witnessed before. And she caught it happening in the mirror the same instant I did and pressed her lips together and tried again. And it still didn't hold. And she finally just stood there a moment, hands braced against the counter, staring at a reflection that wouldn't do what she needed it to do, for what I think might have been the first time in longer than either of us could have named. I watched her a while longer, through the gap in the doorway this woman I'd built 22 years alongside, failing at the one thing I'd never once in all that time seen her fail at. And then I went back to the drawer,
because there was nothing else left in that house for my hands to do that night, and because some part of me, even then,
Still wasn't ready to walk over and tell her it was going to be all right. Mostly because I no longer knew if that would have been true. The lights went down at the premiere, and I already knew which 12 seconds were about to play. And I want you to understand that knowing didn't make the next few minutes any easier to sit through. There's a particular kind of dread that comes from watching a countdown you built yourself, each second closer to a detonation you're the only person in the room who can actually hear ticking. The theater smelled the way theaters always smell before a big screening. Fresh carpet cleaner underneath something older and staler that no amount of cleaning ever fully lifts. And somewhere behind us, a string quartet the studio had hired for the reception was still tuning up faintly through the walls, oblivious to what was about to happen 40 feet away from them. We were seated 4 rows back from the screen, close enough to see faces clearly once the house lights faded far enough that Odette's publicist had judged it a good balance between visibility and comfort, close enough for the cameras stationed along the side aisles to catch her reactions without making her feel, in her words, like she was on trial. Junie sat between us, dressed for the occasion in something new, her hair done the way it never was at home, radiant with an excitement that made the back of my throat ache when I let myself look directly at her. Marcus sat 2 rows ahead with a producer on either side of him, close enough that I could see the exact moment his shoulders set into the particular stillness of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't watching the screen more carefully than anyone else in the theater. The film opened the way these things always open. Sweeping shots of the production, Odette on set, Odette in wardrobe fittings, a voiceover narrating her improbable rise after 19 years of nearly making it. The audience around us responded the way audiences do, warm laughter at the right beats, a few audible sighs at the more sentimental cuts, the whole room settling into the comfortable rhythm of a story they already knew the shape of, and had come to have confirmed rather than questioned. I felt Odette's hand find mine at one point during an early montage, squeezing once, and I squeezed back. And some small, stubborn part of me almost let that gesture mean what it used to mean before I remembered exactly how many months it had been since a squeeze like that had told the truth about anything. I watched the runtime counter in my head instead of the screen for most of it, the way I'd watch a signal chain counting toward the timestamp Priscilla had told me weeks earlier the segment would fall around, give or take. My hand stayed still in my lap the entire time, which took more effort than anything else I did that night. 22 years of training them to move whenever a room needed something fixed, and nothing in that theater was mine to fix anymore. Junie leaned into me at one point during a montage of Odette's early audition tapes, whispering that this was better than she'd expected, and I told her I thought so too. And neither of us knew yet how completely that sentence was about to stop being true. The home office segment arrived a little past the hour mark. Odette on screen, seated at her desk, answering a question about her creative process with the same practiced warmth I'd watched her rehearse in a hallway mirror once, months earlier, a lifetime earlier, back when I still believed the worst thing that segment could do to our family was leave my name out of a sentence. The interview portion ran clean, polished, exactly the footage everyone in that room had been told to expect. Odette's face lit, soft and golden, the way it had been lit for every camera pointed at her since the morning her phone rang before 7. I felt Junie relax slightly beside me, the tension she hadn't known she was carrying, easing out of her shoulders as the segment moved toward what should have been its natural end. And beside me on the other side, I felt Odette's hand still resting loosely in mine, warm, unsuspecting. Then the screen didn't cut away. The interview audio faded the way a scene fades when an editor is transitioning to something new, and for one full second, the theater held nothing but ambient room tone, a held breath of silence that felt, even to me, deliberately extended. And I understood sitting there that Priscilla had made a choice about pacing that no accident could have produced. A professional's patience, applied to the exact moment where patience would do the most damage. A door creaking open. Footsteps unhurried, someone crossing a hardwood floor toward a desk. And then Junie's voice, 20 years old on the recording. So much younger sounding than she looked sitting beside me right now, with her whole body suddenly gone rigid. spine steering in her seat, the way a person's spine straightens when they hear their own voice played back to them in a room full of strangers, before they've had even a full second to brace for it.
"Bye, Uncle Marcus."
4 words. That was all it took. I felt Junie's breath catch beside me, a small, sharp intake of air I doubt anyone else in that theater could have heard over the sound system, and I didn't look at her. Not yet. Because I understood somehow that looking at her in that exact instant would only make the next several seconds harder for both of us to survive. The theater didn't react, yet not fully not on those 4 words alone. Most of the room hadn't caught the significance, hadn't been in that kitchen 4 dinners running, hadn't heard that particular word land the way I had, the way it had landed on me across a table of bread and wine and Marcus's easy laughter. A title was just a title to a stranger. It took the second voice to turn it into something else entirely. Then Odette's voice followed it, low, amused, unmistakably her own. The specific cadence she used when she believed absolutely nobody was listening. Warm and unguarded, in a way I hadn't heard directed at anyone in longer than I wanted to remember. He never checks the equipment logs. I heard the shift move through the theater like weather, a change in air pressure before anyone had consciously understood what they were reacting to. Somewhere behind us, a phone camera's shutter sound went off. Then another. Then a ragged, uncoordinated volley of them, the room's collective attention pivoting in real time from the screen to the row where Odette sat, her face still turned toward the footage of her own voice, playing 8 feet high above her, her hand gone completely still inside mine. No longer warm, exactly, just present, frozen in the grip we'd been holding since before any of this started. I felt her fingers tighten around mine, hard, an involuntary reflex rather than any kind of comfort-seeking. The grip of someone reaching for the nearest solid thing in a room that had just stopped making sense. I didn't pull away. I want that understood clearly, whatever else I did or didn't do in the months leading up to this moment. I let her hold on, because some part of me, even now, even after everything, hadn't finished being the man whose hand she reached for first. The whispering started somewhere to my left and moved through the audience in a current low and fast, the specific hushed urgency of several hundred people all realizing simultaneously that they'd just watched something they weren't supposed to see and weren't leaving the room without. 2 rows ahead, Marcus had gone rigid in a way I recognized instantly. The same controlled stillness I'd watched him perform in an equipment trailer months earlier. Except this time there was no doorframe to lean against, no room to retreat to. Nothing but a folding theater seat, and several hundred pairs of eyes beginning, one by one, to find him. Someone in the projection booth killed the film before the sound department's transition into the next segment ever played. The screen went to a flat, glaring white, the kind of blank light that makes a room feel suddenly much larger than it did a second earlier, and the house lights came up half a beat after that. Too fast, too bright, catching several hundred faces mid-reaction. Phones still raised, mouths still open on words nobody had finished saying. Somewhere near the front, a woman I didn't recognize had both hands pressed flat over her mouth, and a man beside her was already typing something into his phone with the particular urgency of a person who understood he'd just witnessed something worth being first to report. Marcus stood first. I noticed that specifically because everyone else in that theater seemed to still be deciding what to do with their bodies, frozen in that strange collective paralysis that follows any public catastrophe, while he'd already decided, already moving before the lights had fully settled out into the aisle, where a cluster of reporters near the side doors had turned as one organism toward the sudden motion. He moved the way I imagined he moved on set when a take went wrong. Fast, purposeful, already 3 steps into solving a problem before most people had finished registering there was one. I couldn't hear all of what he said to them. I caught pieces the way you catch pieces of anything shouted across a crowded room, his voice pitched to carry further than a normal conversational register, aimed less at the reporters directly in front of him than at everyone else in that theater, still deciding what story they were about to tell people tomorrow. Completely unaware, some kind of editing error, he used the word manipulated at least twice, gesturing back toward the blank screen like it had personally wronged him. And once more, quietly, I heard him say the word malicious.
letting it hang there, unattached to any specific person, a word doing exactly the work he needed it to do, without requiring him to name a single name out loud. I understood watching him work that I was witnessing a man doing the one thing he was genuinely gifted at. Controlling a narrative in real time with no script and no second take available to him. There was something almost admirable in the speed of it. The way he'd already assembled on the spot a version of events where he was simply a colleague swept up in someone else's scandal. A version convincing enough that a stranger walking in off the street might have believed him for a solid 30 seconds before the room's temperature told them otherwise. Nobody in that theater believed him. I could feel that as clearly as I'd felt the whispering current move through the room a few minutes earlier, a second current, now colder, made of several hundred people watching a director loudly disown the very production he'd spent a year attached to, watching the performance of innocence land exactly as unconvincingly as performances usually land when the audience already knows the ending. A few of the reporters were still writing. Most of them, I noticed, had stopped looking at Marcus entirely and turned their attention toward our row instead. Toward Odette. Toward the actual center of gravity this story had just relocated itself to. Junie hadn't moved from her seat beside me. I looked at her once, just once, and found her staring straight ahead at the blank white screen with an expression I recognized immediately, because I'd worn a version of it myself in a kitchen full of broken porcelain. 22 years and a lifetime ago. The specific stillness of a person whose understanding of the world has just rearranged itself faster than their face has caught up to. Her hands sat folded in her lap, exactly the way they'd been folded during the montage of audition tapes 20 minutes earlier, as though her body hadn't yet received the memo that everything around those hands had changed. Odette turned toward me then. I want to describe this carefully, because it's the part of that night I've turned over the most time since. More than Marcus's speech, more than the reporters, more than any of it. She turned in her seat slow and found my eyes across the space where Junie sat frozen between us. And for one long moment, neither of us looked away. The reporters kept talking around us. Marcus kept talking. Somewhere behind us, a producer's raised voice cut through the general noise, already trying to organize some kind of official response, and none of it seemed to touch the small, closed distance between Odette's face and mine. A distance that had somehow gotten smaller in that one look than it had been in the better part of a year of dinners and interviews and carefully managed absences. I don't know exactly what was in her face. I've had a time to think about it, and I still don't have a clean answer whether it was rage or grief or the specific, particular humiliation of a woman realizing all at once, in front of several hundred witnesses, precisely who had built the room she was now standing in the middle of. Maybe it was some combination none of those words quite covers. I've wondered more than once since then whether some smaller part of what I saw in her face that night was almost relief. The strange, terrible relief of a performance finally allowed to stop. What I know is that I didn't look away first. 22 years of learning to make myself small in rooms. And in that exact moment, with cameras still flashing somewhere behind us, and Marcus still talking to anyone who'd listen, I held her gaze steady until she was the one who finally broke it, turning her face down toward her own hands, still folded uselessly in her lap. I stood up. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't say anything to Junie, though some part of me has wished every day since that I'd found even one sentence for my daughter in that moment. Some small thing to hold on to in the wreckage of a night that was about to become the only thing anyone remembered about her 20th year. I thought, standing there for the half second it took to decide which direction to move, about reaching for her hand, the way I'd have reached for it when she was small enough to need reaching for. And I didn't do that either. Because I understood, even in the chaos of that moment, that whatever came next belonged to her and Odette in a way it no longer fully belonged to me. That I'd already done the part only I could do. And the rest of it, the grieving and the sorting out and the slow work of figuring out who they were both going to be to each other after tonight, wasn't mine to manage from the middle of a crowded theater. I stepped past both of them into the aisle, past the reporters, still clustered around Marcus, past a knot of studio executives already huddled together in the kind of low, urgent conversation that precedes a press statement, past a security guard near the exit who looked at me with no particular recognition at all, just another man leaving early, one face among several hundred he had no reason yet to remember. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called after me. That more than anything else that happened in that theater told me exactly how thoroughly invisible I'd become to everyone in that building except the three people who actually mattered, and how completely, finally, I'd stopped minding. I walked out through the side doors into a lobby full of caterers who hadn't yet heard whatever had just happened 40 feet away from them, still setting out trays of food for a reception that everyone inside that theater already understood was never going to happen the way it had been planned. Small, perfect canapes, arranged in careful rows on silver trays. Champagne glasses catching the lobby lights. An entire evening's worth of celebration built and waiting for a party that had ended before it ever properly began. Odette's phone started ringing again, 3 days after the premiere. And for one disorienting morning, I thought half asleep on the guest room mattress I'd been sleeping on since that night, that I was hearing an echo of 8 months earlier, the same insistent buzzing against a hard surface, the same 6 in the morning urgency. It wasn't the same at all. I understood that within about 10 seconds of actually waking up, enough to remember where I was, lying in a room that still smelled faintly of the paint we'd used to redo it 2 summers earlier. A room that had never once in all that time been meant to be anyone's bedroom for 3 weeks running. The calls that morning weren't casting directors. They were a publicist explaining in the careful, padded language people use when they're delivering bad news for a living that 2 brand partnerships had quietly declined to renew. They were a studio attorney requesting a call at Odette's earliest convenience regarding the terms of her current contract. They were by the end of that first week largely nobody at all, a silence on that phone almost as loud as the ringing had been. The particular quiet of a woman whose calendar had emptied itself faster than it had ever filled. I heard fragments of some of those calls through the guest room wall, her voice gone flat and businesslike in a register I'd never once heard from her before. Not even in the worst of the lean years, back when nobody called her about anything at all. I'd moved into the guest room the night we got home from the premiere. No discussion required, both of us understanding without saying so that whatever came next needed its own kind of space to happen in. I stayed in that house another 3 weeks after that, mostly for Junie, who was still finishing out a semester and needed, I told myself, some version of stability underneath her, even while everything above it came apart. I made her breakfast most mornings, the same eggs, the same coffee, the small mechanical rituals of a household continuing to function on inertia alone. I didn't see much of Odette at all, the two of us moving through the house on schedules that had somehow, without either of us planning it, stopped overlapping. Her car pulling out of the driveway most mornings before I'd even finished the coffee, back well after Junie had gone up to bed. The letter arrived on a Thursday, addressed to Junie, specifically, handwritten. The same careful, dated shorthand I imagined Priscilla used for everything that actually mattered to her. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, just Junie's name in neat block letters, and I remember thinking, watching her slide a thumb under the flap, that Priscilla had clearly chosen paper over email on purpose, understanding better than most people that some things deserve the specific weight of a person's actual handwriting. Junie opened it at the kitchen table while I stood at the counter making coffee I didn't especially want, mostly for something to do with my hands while she read, and I watched her face change while she went through it. The particular stillness of someone encountering a fact that rearranges everything that came before it. She read it twice. I could tell by the way her eyes moved back to the top of the page, a second time slower, the way you reread something you need to be certain you understood correctly the first time. When she finally looked up at me, she didn't say anything right away, just held the letter loosely in one hand, her thumb pressed against the crease where she'd folded it. And I felt, standing there with a coffee mug going cold in my grip, the specific dread of a man who understands a conversation is about to happen and has no ability left to control its shape.
She asked me if it was true that I'd first reached out to Priscilla back in February. Not April, not the week I'd told her. About the week I'd told myself was the beginning of it, but February. 4 months before the premiere. Weeks before Marcus had ever caught me alone in that equipment trailer. Weeks before I'd fully admitted to myself that I was doing anything at all. I didn't lie to her. I want that understood even now, even this far into a story where I've already admitted to far worse. I told her it was true. I told her that back in February, not long after the night I first heard Odette's voice through a wireless channel I shouldn't have been listening to, I'd sent Priscilla a routine-sounding email about equipment recommendations for the home office setup. A genuinely useful piece of technical advice about boundary mic placement that happened purely as a professional courtesy to improve the acoustics of that specific room considerably. I told Junie I hadn't fully understood sending that email, what I was actually building toward that. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a technician doing his job a little more thoroughly than usual. I told her that was true as far as I could still tell, and that I also understood saying it out loud to my own daughter at a kitchen table how much that distinction was starting to sound like something a guilty man tells himself to sleep at night. A sentence that had worked well enough on me for months and was starting, finally, to stop working. Junie set the letter down on the table, smoothing it flat with one hand, an unconscious gesture, and asked me the question I'd been waiting 4 weeks for someone to finally ask directly. Had I planned this from the very beginning? From before any of the rest of it? The dinners, the interview, all of it? Or had I simply found myself, month by month, walking further down a road I'd started on almost by accident? I told her I honestly didn't know anymore where the accident ended and the plan began. I told her that was the truest answer I had, and that I understood it wasn't the answer she wanted, the kind of clean, decisive answer a 20-year-old deserved from her own father. And I watched her absorb that non-answer the way you absorb something you already suspected, but had been hoping right up until the last possible second not to have confirmed. I went out to the garage that evening after she'd gone up to her room, needing my hands busy the way I always needed them busy, and found the old mixing console still sitting on the workbench where I'd left it months earlier. Half a length of cable still coiled beside it, exactly where I'd set it down the night Priscilla first found me there on a Saturday. My hands weren't steady picking it up. I noticed that specifically, the way I noticed most things by then. The faint, persistent tremor running through fingers that had spent 22 years being the steadiest thing in every room I'd ever stood in. Hands that had rewired boards with 100 more connections than this one, without a single misstep. Now unable to manage a simple loop of cable without it slipping loose halfway through. I sat there a long while turning a spool of cable over and over without actually managing to coil a single loop of it correctly. The work light overhead humming its familiar patient hum. And I thought about February, about a routine-sounding email I'd sent on an ordinary Tuesday, without fully understanding what I was setting in motion. And I understood, sitting there with cable slipping uselessly through hands that had never failed me before, that I'd finally found the one piece of equipment in that garage I no longer knew how to fix. Junie found me in the garage a little before midnight. I hadn't heard the door, too absorbed in a spool of cable that still wouldn't coil right, no matter how many times I started over, and when I looked up, she was standing just inside the doorway. In an old sweatshirt of mine, she'd apparently claimed at some point without my noticing, arms crossed against the evening chill that had settled into the garage once the sun went down. Her hair was down, no longer in the careful style she'd worn for the premiere weeks earlier, and for a moment, in the dim work light, she looked younger than 20. Looked almost like the kid who used to fall asleep in this same garage, waiting for me to finish a repair she'd insisted on watching. She didn't sit. I offered her the stool beside the workbench, the one she used to perch on as a kid while I explained what I was fixing back when she still asked why about everything, patient enough to wait through an entire explanation of a circuit board just to understand how the pieces connected. She shook her head, staying standing near the door instead, like she wanted the option of leaving quickly available to her if this conversation went somewhere she couldn't stay for. "Dad," she said, and stopped, and I set the cable down and gave her my full attention, because I recognized that particular pause, the sound of someone working up to a question they'd already decided they needed the answer to, regardless of what it cost either of us.
"Did you do this for me?" she asked. "Or did you do it for you?" I want to walk you through exactly what happened in my head in the several seconds after she asked that, because those seconds matter more to me now than almost anything else in this entire account. My first instinct, the fast one, the one that arrived before any actual thought had time to form behind it, was to say, "For you, of course, all of it. For you, because that was the answer that would let her sleep that night. The answer that turned 4 months of engineered silence into a father's sacrifice instead of whatever messier, more selfish thing it might actually have been." It would have been so easy to say. I could feel the shape of it already sitting in my mouth. 3 words, warm, familiar, the kind of sentence a good father says without needing to think twice about whether it's entirely true. I opened my mouth to say it. I stopped, because I understood in the half-second before the words would have left me that it wasn't entirely true, and that Junie, standing there in my old sweatshirt with her arms crossed and her whole face braced for whatever I said next, deserved better from me than one more easy sentence built to make a hard room more comfortable to stand in. I'd spent 22 years being exactly that kind of useful, the man who said the thing that smoothed a situation over, who kept rooms functioning instead of telling anyone what was actually broken inside them. I built a whole life, and apparently an entire quiet campaign of retribution, out of precisely that skill. I thought about February. I thought about the email I'd sent Priscilla, technically about equipment, actually about something I hadn't been ready to name even to myself yet. I thought about the boundary mic diagram, the 6 inches I'd measured and never moved, the phone call I'd made under a name that gave nothing away. I thought about the exact moment in that kitchen when Junie had called Marcus uncle without a flicker of hesitation, and how something in me had gone quiet and cold and purposeful in a way it never had before that dinner. I tried to locate somewhere in that whole sequence the exact moment where protecting Junie had been the reason, separate and identifiable from the moment where being seen again, being someone whose name got said out loud at a dinner table, had become its own reason entirely. I couldn't find the seam. That was the truth I was standing on, the actual answer underneath the one that would have been kinder to give her. Somewhere in the last several months, my need to protect my daughter and my need to stop being erased had braided together so completely that I no longer had any honest way to tell her which one had been driving, not without lying to both of us in the process. I wanted standing there for there to be a clean answer, a single motive I could hold up and hand to her intact. There wasn't one. There had never been one, I understood now. Only the two of them tangled together so thoroughly that pulling on either thread just tightened the other. I could have told her some version of that. I could have tried to explain the braid walked her through my own confusion, the way I've tried to walk you through it here, given her something more honest than a clean for you, but softer than the truth sitting underneath it. Some careful hedged middle ground, a father's version of diplomacy. I didn't do that either. Standing there, I understood that even the hedged version would have been its own kind of performance. One more sentence engineered to manage how a room received me, and I'd built enough of those already to last several lifetimes. I stood there instead in a garage smelling faintly of solder and old coffee, with my daughter waiting for an answer I didn't have a way to give her that wouldn't be either a lie or a wound. And I let the silence stretch out between us longer than any silence I'd let stretch in months. Because for the first time since all of this started, I didn't have a maintenance trick left in me. No cable to coil, no small mechanical task to substitute for the sentence I owed her. My hands sat useless at my sides, still faintly trembling from earlier, and I let her see that too. Let her see the tremor along with the silence. Because hiding it would have been just one more small dishonesty added to a pile already too tall to add to in good conscience. Junie watched me not answer. I want to be precise about what her face did in that silence, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else since. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't quite disappointment either. It was something closer to recognition, the specific look of a person watching someone finally stop performing certainty they don't actually have.
Watching a father who had spent her entire life fixing things in front of her finally stand in a room with something he couldn't fix and refuse to pretend otherwise. She didn't ask again. She didn't fill the silence for me either, the way a kinder or more frightened version of her might have, rushing to supply the answer she wanted to hear so both of us could stop standing in the discomfort of not having one. She just watched me a while longer, arms still crossed, and then she nodded once, slow, an acknowledgement of something neither of us had put into words, and turned and went back toward the house, leaving me alone with a spool of cable I still. That night never did manage to coil correctly. I couldn't tell in that garage in that silence whether what I was giving her was the truth she deserved, or simply one more thing I'd failed to find the right words for, at the moment that mattered most. I still can't tell you which one it was all this time later, and I've stopped expecting that particular uncertainty to ever fully resolve itself. The door to my own workshop still sticks a little in the frame 1 year on, no matter how many times I've planned the edge down. I've come to like that about it. Some things are worth leaving slightly imperfect, if only so a man has one small, honest problem left to solve with his hands, whenever the rest of a day hasn't given him anything else to fix. The rest of the space came together the way most things in my life have come together, slowly, one deliberate choice at a time. Shelves. I built myself a workbench salvaged from a studio that had gone under during the pandemic years. Everything arranged exactly where my hands expected to find it, without needing to look. I run the business out of a converted garage bay, a few miles from the old soundstage, now independent no production company's schedule, dictating which hours belong to me. Word travels fast in an industry that size, and it turned out there were more people than I'd expected who wanted their equipment serviced by a technician who didn't need supervising, who showed up early and didn't need his work checked twice. I'd worried in the early months that my name might carry too much attached to it by then for anyone to want it in their equipment logs. It hadn't worked out that way. If anything, the work had come easier once I'd stopped needing it to be invisible. The divorce finalized 8 months ago, quiet, uncontested, on the points that mattered, the kind of ending that gets handled by lawyers exchanging documents, rather than anyone raising a voice in a courtroom. Odette moved to a smaller place across town. I heard secondhand that she'd taken a teaching position at a university theater program, molding the next generation of people who wanted the things she'd finally gotten and then lost inside of a single winter. I hope, when I let myself think about it honestly, that she's found something in that work worth having, something that doesn't depend on anyone else's cameras or anyone else's schedule to feel real. I don't think about Marcus much anymore, which surprised me the first time I noticed it. The way an old ache can simply stop being the loudest thing in a room without you consciously deciding to quiet it. I heard he'd relocated to another city for work, some project far enough removed from anything connected to us that his name had mostly stopped arriving in my life at all. I was coiling a length of cable at the workbench when I heard tires on the gravel outside. Unhurried, familiar, in a way I recognized before I'd even turned around. My hands finished the loop cleanly, first try. No hesitation, no tremor. The specific steadiness that had taken most of a year to fully return to me. And I set the coiled cable down on its hook exactly where it belonged before I went to the door. Junie stood in the driveway a moment before coming in, the way she always did now, giving both of us a beat to adjust before the visit officially started. She was home for a long weekend, she said, and thought she'd stop by. She didn't say why. I didn't ask. We'd learned over the past year, in the careful, incremental way two people learn anything difficult together, that some visits worked better without a stated purpose attached to them, that showing up was frequently the entire point, and naming it out loud would only make it smaller. Her hair was longer than it had been at the premiere, pulled back simply, no styling to it at all, and she'd traded whatever she used to wear for a job interview or a family event for jeans and a jacket that looked like it actually belonged to her, rather than to whatever version of herself a camera might have preferred. She came in and sat on the same stool she'd refused to sit on in my old garage, the night she'd asked me the hardest question either of us had ever asked out loud. And I noticed the way I noticed most things by habit now, that she chose it without hesitation, this time settling onto it like a piece of furniture that belonged to her
as much as it belonged to me. We didn't talk about much. She asked what I was working on, and I told her. Walked her through the repair the way I used to when she was young enough to ask why about everything, and she listened with something that might have been genuine interest, or might have simply been the specific patience people extend to a parent they're still deciding how much to let back in. And I found I didn't need to know which one it was to appreciate her sitting there anyway. At one point, she noticed the old VU meter sitting on a shelf above the workbench where I'd placed it when I first set up this space. Its needle resting flat at 0, no power cable running to it at all. She asked if it still worked. I told her I didn't actually know that I hadn't plugged it in since I'd moved it here, that some part of me had simply wanted it close by, without needing it to do anything anymore. I told her it had sat on the kitchen counter the morning her mother's phone rang, all those months ago, that I'd been watching its needle when the call came in, and that I'd carried it here without fully deciding why, only that some instruments earn a place in a room, regardless of whether they're still doing the job they were built for. She didn't ask why beyond that. She looked at it a moment longer, the same unlit, honest little instrument that had sat on our kitchen counter the morning her mother's phone rang before 7. And something crossed her face I couldn't fully read. And then she let it go and asked instead whether I still had that recipe for the pasta I used to make on Sundays, the one with too much garlic. And I told her I did, and she said she might stay for dinner if the offer still stood. I told her it always would. She stayed until almost 9 that night, longer than any visit since the divorce. And when she finally left, hugging me at the door in the quick, still slightly careful way she'd hugged me for months now, neither of us said anything about forgiveness, or about whether what I'd done had been for her or for myself, or about any of the questions that had once needed answering in a cold garage at midnight. Some things I've come to understand don't get resolved so much as they get carried differently over time. A weight that never fully sets down but does eventually stop being the only thing in the room, making space little by little for pasta on a Sunday and a stool she no longer hesitated to sit on. After she drove off, I went back inside and looked at the VU meter a while longer, sitting dark and unplugged on its shelf, the needle exactly where it had rested for a year now, honest in its own way, even powered down, telling the truth about nothing because there was nothing left running through it that needed measuring. I thought about plugging it in, just to see, just to know whether the old wiring inside it still had any life left in it after all this time sitting idle. I decided against it in the end. I left it there. I didn't plug it in. Some instruments, I've decided, do their most important work simply by being visible whether or not anyone ever asks them to read anything again. Sitting quiet on a shelf as proof that a room was once loud enough to need measuring at all, and that somebody eventually learned to stop needing the reading to know what he'd lived through. I still open that shop every morning at 6, same as I always did, on every set I ever worked, coiling cable before the first customer's truck even reaches the gravel. Some mornings I catch myself glancing up at that dark meter on the shelf, half expecting the needle to twitch on its own the way it used to whenever a room got loud enough to matter. It never does. I've stopped needing it to. I used to believe that if I never asked to be seen, I'd never have to find out whether I deserved to be. That's a tidy kind of math, and it turned out to be wrong. Devotion that nobody ever notices doesn't stay pure just because it stays quiet. It goes looking for another way to be heard, and mine went looking through 6 inches of boundary mic and 11 seconds of silence on a phone call. I don't think what I did was entirely love, and I don't think it was entirely fear either. I think most of us run both currents through the same wire all the time, and the only real choice we ever get is whether we let anyone check the reading before it's too late to matter. If you've ever kept the peace by staying quiet long past the point where quiet stopped being kindness, I don't have a tidy lesson to hand you. I only have what it cost me and what it gave back, and the strange fact that both of those turned out to be true about the same 12 seconds at the same time. So here's the question I still don't have a clean answer to. The one I'd ask you if you were sitting on that stool across from me tonight. If the people who are supposed to see you never learn to look on their own, is it braver to keep making yourself impossible to miss, whatever that costs everyone in the room, or to finally just walk out and let the silence be the whole answer? Tell me which one you'd choose.
I'm still